A movie in less than 15 minutes. Okay, let's go. Dan Morgan, a loving father and devoted husband, lives a quiet suburban life with his wife and their 3 children. However, unbeknownst to his family, Dan was once one of the government's deadliest assassins, tasked with eliminating the world's most dangerous threats. When his secret past catches up to him, Dan must take his unsuspecting family on the run, turning their peaceful existence into a thrilling road trip adventure. The story begins in the suburbs of New York City. Dan is doing great at selling cars because he notices small details others might miss. He wins the title of Salesman of the Month again. Dan really enjoys his simple life and looks forward to celebrating his anniversary with his wife, Jessica. They have 3 kids, Nina, Kyle, and Max. Nina and Kyle do argue a lot, which stresses out the family. Dan is annoyed with Kyle for always playing video games and wants him to go outside more often. Nina wants to change her college major because of her boyfriend. This worries Dan. He advises his children, but they hardly listen. Kyle often secretly plays games at a friend's house, and Nina believes she's old enough to make decisions on her own. Dan and his wife really enjoy going to a carnival every year for their anniversary, but Jessica yearned for more excitement and change in their lives. During a sweet moment when Dan and Jessica share a kiss, a stranger takes a picture of them without their permission. The person posts the photo online and starts bothering Dan. Things escalate when the person spills a drink on Dan and insults Jessica. Despite the provocation and utter disrespect, Dan walks away trying to prevent a scene by fighting back. He hates violence, and Jessica says she was happy that he didn't want Dan to fight the guy. At home, Dan feels as if he has to hold back. The confrontation doesn't leave his mind. Jessica finds an outlet in boxing, where an accidental punch to her sparring partner leads to an unexpected friendship over smoothies. Opening up to her new friend named Gwen, who is also a travel agent, Jessica shares her sense of feeling trapped. She appreciates Dan's qualities as a husband and father, but is upset by his devotion with their life as it is. The next day, while out shopping with baby Max, Dan's attention is drawn to a suspicious man seemingly watching him. Acting cautiously, Dan is quick to react when the man makes a move to attack. Even with Max with him, Dan skillfully manages to fend off the attacker, neutralizing him with ease. The locals are surprised, and even his neighbors notice something different about Dan. At home, sensing looming trouble in Buffalo, Dan opens up a secret compartment containing guns, his old identities, and loads of cash. Dan then contacts Augie, a former associate, to arrange fake passports, indicating they're in danger. Augie believes that it's McCaffrey, Dan's former boss, and advises Dan to disappear as soon as possible. It is then revealed that Dan was an assassin in the past. He has kept it a secret from his family. Most likely, McCaffrey discovered Dan because of the picture at the carnival. Dan rushes to Nina at an editorial meeting at school. He then discovered she quit 3 months ago. After bribing her friend, she sells her out. He finds Nina under the bleachers, upset that she abandoned her dream. But there's no time to dwell on this as they need to get her brother from the chess club. However, Dan is disappointed to discover him at their neighbor's house with his gaming setup. Cautious, Dan tells his kids that they are going on a trip to Las Vegas. In no time, he rushes to Jessica's work. Dan persuades her to go on the spontaneous trip she so much desired. She becomes excited and decides to go as she has always wanted something different. But the moment they are about to leave, he realizes McCaffrey's men are already there. As a bus passes through, Dan swiftly evades his pursuers. After a while, they catch up to Dan, but he still manages to maneuver around without his family suspecting a thing. Dan noticing he is being tracked, he then drives into a dealership. He then raises the car and spots a tracking device. Dan then hides quickly just as his assailants pass through. The family still has no idea what is going on. Dan places the tracker on his colleague's car and urges him to give that car a spin on the highway. The pursuers take the bait and the threat is nullified. While his family are using their phones and posting about their trip to remain anonymous, Dan seizes everyone's phones. It becomes a device-free trip. The only problem is that they don't know the way to get there. They stop over to find maps for their trip. The family actually begins to bond for the first time in a long time. Meanwhile, Dan's former boss McAfee visits Dan's house and is sure one of his family members will make a mistake soon. While Dan spoke with his sister, A girl recognizes Kyle from his streaming career and asks for a selfie. Dan sees Kyle and the stranger taking selfies and knows that McCaffrey will be on his tail soon, so he decides to continue driving to avoid being found. While driving, Dan notices his pursuers trailing him yet again. Though his family is asleep, he turns on music on all of their headphones while trying to react. His side mirror is then shot, but he succeeds in getting rid of one, barely managing to avoid a crash and bumping into another. His family is still asleep. Truth be told, they do sleep really deep. The third guy just goes flying through a billboard. After driving all night, Dan finally closes his eyes, but his family is awake half a mile away from the college Nina wants to attend. She argues her way into seeing it. It's a gorgeous place with a lot of festivities. Jessica even shows off her keg stand skills. Nina is dumbfounded by her mom's actions. The big reason Nina wanted to see the campus is because of her boyfriend Trevor attending this college. On the campus tour, Dan spots a German man on his phone and suspects he might be an operative for McCaffrey. However, Dan realizes his mistake when he is unexpectedly attacked by a different individual. They start to fight in the college lab, and after a short scuffle, Dan incapacitates the assailant, rejoining his family shortly after to keep moving. But Nina went to see Trevor. She finds him cheating on her. She returns crying, and Dan teaches her a martial arts move that she uses on Trevor, making her feel much better and appreciate her family more. Back on the road, the family bonds even more. As Nina is driving, she thanks Dan for always being there for her, and thinks of getting back her editorial position at school. At a small motel, the parents finally let off some steam. Jessica is in love with the spontaneous Dan. She feels that something is different about him. Dan calls Augie, who is on his way to deliver the new fake identities to Dan and his family. The only problem is that he hasn't told them yet. He then sneakily returns the phone he stole and tries to prepare himself for the conversation. Kyle joins him, and they finally talk about him being a streamer. It's something he's good at, like pro-level good. He wants to prove it over laser tag with Dan. They bet on it, first to 3 kills. This should be a breeze for Dan, being an ex-assassin and all. He gets the first tag and the second, then Kyle retaliates with 2 of his own, but Dan gets the last one. Kyle feels conned, but the two grow closer. Finally arriving in Las Vegas, they are staying at one of the top suites in the city. But first, Dan has to run downstairs. He meets with Augie, who hands him their new identities and a one-way flight to Vancouver for a hefty payout. Dan plans to tell Jessica the truth over a romantic dinner. While the kids babysit 10-month-old Max, Dan tells them not to leave the suite under any circumstance, not as though they will actually adhere. McCaffrey's men become aware of Dan's location. Being a popular gamer, Kyle goes to the High Perks gaming arena and is recognized. He even gets to meet a popular gamer known as Valkyrie. She lets him join her team for the finals in Valorant, but McCaffrey's men are secretly watching. While Nina gets comfortable with one of the gamers who gave his spot to Kyle, Kyle is single-handedly destroying the enemy team. Dan tries to tell Jessica the truth, but gets interrupted at every moment and decides to postpone it a bit and go gambling with her. After a while, he decides to check up on the kids, but his call goes unanswered, so they head back up. Jessica gets fooled by dummies thinking her kids are sleeping, setting Dan's mind at ease. Jessica goes to freshen up and turns on some romantic mood music with Love Mist. That's exactly when McCaffrey's men strike. Dan throws vodka and shoots it, setting the assailants on fire and neutralizing them. But Jessica is taken hostage. Dan puts down his gun but slightly grabs a knife. When the assailant calls Dan Sean, a painful realization hits Jessica. While the guy is yapping, Dan neutralizes him as well. Jessica quickly runs to the kids but finds the dummies. She knows they have to look in High Perks since that's all Kyle's been talking about. Just as the game ends, their parents arrive and pick them up. Dan finally comes clean. He's a covert assassin, and his ex-colleagues are here to kill him. The kids don't believe it until they get shot at. Taking cover behind a car, Dan neutralizes the assailant, but her bulletproof vest keeps her alive, so they go for a quick round 2. Dan finally comes clean about his history of being a hired assassin and that he's killed 42 people. Kyle thinks Dan is a hypocrite, and now they understand why Dan never wanted to leave the city and is so against social media. He then hands them their new identities. Nina is now Molly and Kyle is Van. Yeah, like a vehicle. After lying to them for 18 years, the family refuses to accept him. Jessica is leaving him and will take responsibility for the kids. She calls Gwen, asking for help, while Dan is left to guard outside until the very morning. Despite Dan trying to explain that it's not safe and McCaffrey will come after them, Jessica just tells him to make it safe and stay away from them. When Jessica arrives, it turns out Gwen is a pretty powerful woman. Suddenly, Gwen is talking about her ex who made a whole new life with an insufferable woman and such. Then she made friends with a woman and waited for her to walk into her trap. Yeah, Jessica had been fooled all along. McCaffrey then arrives. McCaffrey gives Dan a call, showing he has held his family hostage. He arranges a meeting in an abandoned hotel. McCaffrey's men are all over the place. Dan must be flattered. Arriving at the penthouse, McCaffrey asks for a sarcastic hug. It turns out he's Dan's father. Wow, what a loving father he must be. McCaffrey wants him back in the business. If he refuses, his family dies. With no other option, Dan agrees to do it. Suddenly, the kids want Jessica to protect Dan, even though they wanted to cut ties with him a second ago. Kyle childishly pushes elevator buttons, and while the kids try to persuade their mother that they can't abandon Dan, Jessica begins to change Max's diaper and stuffs it in the bad guy's face, throwing him off to his death. They will go get their dad back. While McCaffrey goes to make some arrangements, Gwen begins to seduce Dan back into loving her, ignoring the tech guy. She's aware of Dan's tactics. The family is there to rescue him as he puts Gwen to sleep. The tech guy is taken captive. Dan apologizes for keeping secrets from Jessica and promises to always tell her the truth. He wants to be her husband and a loving father. Kyle then tries out the drone, and it turns out Dan is very good with technology. McCaffrey's men are coming. He tells his family to go to the roof, and he will deal with them. Kyle will be his eyes and ears. Kyle uses the drone to spot McCaffrey's men and relays information to Dan, who despite the numbers, skillfully deals with them. McCaffrey then notices that the drone is aiding Dan and wakes Gwen up to find the family. Dan tells his dad to call it off, but he doesn't listen. Despite 10 guys shooting with automatic rifles, no one manages to hit Dan. Poor accuracy for assassins, I guess. Noticing the elevator going up, Jessica hides the kids and shoots as the elevator arrives, but Gwen just chills on the left. Gwen taunts Jess, knowing that she has an advantage in hand-to-hand combat, not taking her seriously. Wow, after getting punched, what an irony. Kyle then informs his dad of the position of his assailants. Dan knocks them down one by one. McCaffrey is in awe of his son's skills. He finally shoots down the drone. Meanwhile, as the combat continues, Gwen comes out victorious, burying Jessica under a pile of rubble. McCaffrey knocks Dan down and has a clear shot on him, but begins to rant about how weak family has made him. Meanwhile, Gwen corners the kids, and that gives Jessica the strength to lift up the debris, but she is flung like a bag of feathers. Dan then dismantles McCaffrey's guns, resulting in a fistfight. Jessica gathers herself and picks up a bamboo stick and goes for an athletic jump like a pole vaulter she once was, but fails miserably. Gwen finds it funny when Jessica tries again, but this time, Jessica manages to land a hit. McCaffrey beats Dan in a fight and grabs a gun to finish him off. But then the family comes in, and Nina tells Dan they still care about him. This then gives Dan a chance to act. The family are now safe as the police arrive the scene. 6 months later, Nina becomes a famous journalist. Dan kickoffs a company teaching self-defense and hires Augie. Jessica becomes an athletic coach, and Kyle still plays video games online. The family gets ready for a big trip, packing up a big RV to take Nina to Stanford. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. See you in the next video.